No one ever thinks something terrible can happen in a place like this. A quiet American town, the kind where mornings begin slowly, where neighbors recognize each other's cars, and where nothing ever seems urgent enough to cause alarm. This was the kind of town people described as safe, and for years, everyone believed that word without question. But what if safety was just an illusion? Welcome to Dark Town Archives, where we examine the stories hidden beneath calm streets and familiar faces. This town didn't appear on national news. It wasn't known for crime, controversy, or chaos. In fact, it was known for the opposite: peace, routine, predictability. The kind of place where life moved so steadily that people stopped paying attention to what was happening around them. And that's exactly how this story began, quietly. The incident itself didn't feel dramatic at first. There were no flashing headlines, no urgent warnings, no sense that something was wrong. Authorities gave an explanation quickly, confidently, and without hesitation. Most people accepted it without a second thought. After all, why wouldn't they? This was a town built on trust. Trust in neighbors, trust in institutions, and trust in the idea that bad things happened somewhere else. Days passed, then weeks. Conversations moved on. The event became a footnote, something people mentioned briefly before changing the subject. And slowly, almost invisibly, it faded into the background of everyday life. But beneath that calm surface, something didn't sit right. A few residents felt it, a quiet discomfort they couldn't quite explain. Small details felt off. Certain timelines didn't seem to line up perfectly. But those thoughts were easy to dismiss. Questioning the official story felt unnecessary. And in a small town like this, unnecessary questions could feel disruptive. So no one asked them. In places like this, silence isn't always forced. Sometimes it's chosen out of politeness, out of loyalty, out of the belief that asking questions might do more harm than good. And slowly, silence becomes normal. Years went by. New families moved in, old ones moved away. The town continued to function as if nothing unusual had ever happened. Children grew up hearing the story the same way every time, simplified, softened, and stripped of anything uncomfortable. Over time, the explanation hardened into fact, not because it was proven, but because it was repeated. And repetition has power. What makes this case disturbing isn't just the event itself, it's the absence of reaction, the lack of urgency, the way an entire community collectively decided that the answer they were given was good enough. Because when no one asks questions, no one looks deeper. And when no one looks deeper, mistakes stay buried. At Dark Town Archives, we've seen this pattern again and again. Crimes don't always remain hidden because they're clever. Sometimes they remain hidden because they're inconvenient, because uncovering the truth would mean admitting that something was missed, or worse, ignored. This town didn't believe it was hiding anything. It believed it was protecting itself. But protection without truth comes at a cost. As time passed, small cracks began to form. A comment here, a forgotten detail there, nothing loud enough to cause alarm, but enough to suggest that the original story might not be complete. Still, the town resisted the idea of revisiting the past. It was easier to move forward than to look back. And yet the past doesn't disappear just because it's ignored. In the end, the most unsettling part of the story isn't what happened on that day, it's what happened afterward. The collective decision to accept, to move on, and to never ask the one question that mattered most. Because in this quiet town, no one asked what really happened. And that silence would follow them for years. When the explanation was first given, it sounded simple, too simple. Authorities described the incident as unfortunate but ordinary, the kind of thing that didn't require deeper scrutiny. There was no sign of danger, no reason for panic, and according to officials, no mystery to solve. For most people in the town, that was enough. Life went on. People trusted the explanation because trust was the foundation of this community. In a place like this, questioning authority felt unnecessary, almost rude. Law enforcement officers weren't outsiders. They were neighbors, friends, familiar faces seen at school events and local stores. Doubting them felt like doubting the town itself. So the explanation settled in quickly. At first, it was discussed openly. People talked about it in passing, repeating the same details again and again until they became routine. Over time, those details lost their sharp edges. What once felt unsettling slowly became normalized. The story shortened, the uncomfortable parts faded away, and with each retelling, fewer questions were asked. But buried beneath that accepted version were details that never quite fit together. The timeline, for example, seemed unusually vague. Certain moments were explained broadly without precision. Key actions were described without context. But these inconsistencies were settled, easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. And no one was looking. At Darktown Archives, we often see how early assumptions shape everything that follows. Once a conclusion is reached, evidence stops being examined objectively. Instead of asking what happened, the question becomes, how does this fit what we already believe? That's exactly what happened here. Whitney's statements were taken, but not challenged. Follow-up questions that should have been obvious were never asked. Certain details were recorded, then quietly set aside, not because they were disproven, but because they complicated the narrative. In small towns, complexity is uncomfortable. Simple answers are easier to live with. As months turned into years, the case became frozen in its original form. Any attempt to revisit it was met with resistance. Not hostility, but fatigue. People didn't want to reopen something they believed was already resolved. Revisiting the past felt unnecessary, even disruptive. And so silence did the rest. The official version became the only version. It was taught, repeated, and accepted. New residents learned it as local history. Younger generations grew up believing it without ever questioning how it was formed. The explanation survived not because it was tested, but because it was never challenged. But time has a way of changing perspective. Years later, investigative standards elsewhere improved. Technology advanced. What once passed as thorough now appeared careless, and slowly this case began to look outdated, like a story from another era, preserved more by tradition than truth. That's when the cracks became visible. Looking back, the lack of documentation stood out. Important steps that should have been routine were missing entirely. Certain procedures were assumed, not confirmed. It wasn't that the investigation was intentionally flawed. It was rushed, comfortable, and unchallenged. And comfort can be dangerous. At Darktown Archives, we believe the most revealing part of any case is not what investigators found, but what they never looked for, because the absence of questions often speaks louder than the answers. That's exactly what happened here. By accepting the explanation so easily, it allowed uncertainty to settle in quietly. It allowed doubt to remain unresolved, and it allowed a story built on assumption to replace one built on evidence. The incident was no longer just an event. It had become a lesson in how easily truth can be shaped when no one pushes back. And soon someone would. Someone who noticed the gaps. Someone who felt the discomfort others ignored. Someone who would finally ask the question this town avoided for years. And once that question was asked, there would be no turning back. For a long time, the past stayed exactly where the town wanted it, buried. The accepted explanation remained untouched, protected by time and routine. But every story, no matter how carefully preserved, has weak points. And in this case, those weak points were small details that refused to disappear. It started quietly. Years after the incident, someone revisited the old records, not with the intention of reopening the case, but simply to review it. What they found wasn't dramatic at first. No shocking confession, no sudden revelation, just inconsistencies, minor ones, the kind that might not mean much on their own, but together they told a different story. The timeline was the first problem. Certain events were recorded out of order. Times overlapped in ways that didn't make sense. Actions were described without clear explanations of who was present or why decisions were made. These weren't errors that proved anything, but they were errors that raised questions, and questions, once asked, have a way of multiplying. At Darktown Archives, we've learned that the truth often hides in what feels insignificant. A missing minute, an unexplained delay, a report written too vaguely. This case had all of them. As the records were examined more closely, something else became clear. Follow-up never happened. Witness statements were taken once and then left alone. No second interviews, no attempts to clarify contradictions. The investigation moved forward as if everything fit, even when it didn't. One statement in particular stood out, not because it was detailed, but because it was incomplete. Important questions were never asked. Basic clarifications were missing, and yet the statement was accepted as final. At the time, no one seemed concerned. Looking back, it was impossible to ignore. Why wasn't this questioned? The answer wasn't corruption or conspiracy. It was something far more common, assumption. Investigators assumed the explanation was correct, so they didn't feel the need to dig deeper. And once that assumption took hold, everything else was shaped around it. This is where the case truly began to unravel. When the details were laid out again, slowly, carefully, a different picture emerged. Not a clear answer, but a pattern. A pattern of shortcuts, of comfort, of choosing the easiest conclusion instead of the most accurate one. And suddenly, the incident didn't look simple anymore. As word spread that the case was being re-examined, reactions within the town were mixed. Some people were curious, others were uncomfortable. A few were openly resistant, not because they were hiding anything, but because revisiting the past felt unsettling. Admitting that something was missed meant admitting that trust had been misplaced, and that's a difficult thing for any community to face. At Darktown Archives, we often see how communities protect their sense of identity. This town saw itself as safe, orderly, and reliable. Accepting that a serious mistake may have occurred threatened that image, so doubt was treated as disruption. But doubt didn't go away. The more questions were asked, the more gaps appeared. Procedures that should have been standard were never documented. Decisions were made without explanation. Important evidence was assumed to be irrelevant.
not because it was proven so, but because it complicated the narrative. What once looked like a resolved case now looked unfinished. And perhaps the most unsettling realization of all was this. If these details had been examined earlier, the outcome might have been very different. Years of uncertainty could have been avoided. Truth might have surfaced sooner. Instead, time had done what it always does. It buried mistakes under familiarity. But now the past was resurfacing, and the town was being forced to confront something it had avoided for years, the possibility that the explanation everyone accepted was never the full truth. As the investigation moved forward again and once, one thing became clear. This wasn't just about solving a case anymore. It was about understanding how easily truth can be lost when no one insists on finding it. And soon the town would realize that some questions, once ignored, come back louder than ever. When questions finally reached the surface, the town didn't react with anger, it reacted with discomfort, a quiet, uneasy discomfort that spread through conversations, meetings, and everyday interactions. People didn't shout, they didn't protest, they simply didn't want to talk about it. For years, the accepted explanation had been enough. It allowed life to move forward without interruption. But now that sense of certainty was being challenged.